I'm going to do today or maybe tomorrow, going to do a video that involves sculpting. I'm going to sculpt something like this kind of ogre kind of elf guy. So I sculpted this last night, just kind of a random thing to sculpt. He's kind of like I don't know, he's like a fantasy man, a fantasy creature, and it's just obviously a bust, and it's really just a sketch. There's no, it's just a sketch for like a concept. And I can paint it. I will paint it with Vertex paint when I do a new version of it. Today, though, I want to talk about um, for the introduction to sculpting because I did a video on the very basics of sculpting in Blender, which I showed you the basic brushes. But there's a basic problem when you sculpt in Blender, and that's what this video is about. So I'm going to, if you see this thing, clearly this has been, well, maybe not clearly, this has been done with just a sphere. Started with a sphere, and everything was done in the sculpting part. There was no extrusion. It was just pulled out and reshaped from a sphere. Still kind of looks a bit spherical because he's kind of a round-headed guy. But it was basically a sphere that was pulled out. Now, first of all, you're going to see something. I want to show you the actual the mesh in edit mode, and you'll see that it's extremely high poly. Once it goes, ta-da, here it is. It's extremely high poly, and you'll notice also the polygons look kind of weird. They're very small, but there's all these weird kind of irregularities here, and that's because this is not a topology that is just a bunch of quads like you would if you just if you took a primitive and you shaped it, it would still be generally a bunch of quads. This you see is this weird looking thing, and that's because what it is a voxel remesh. It has been remeshed from the sphere, and I'll show you why and how. So first of all, let me get rid of this thing. So when you start to sculpt, let's say you're going to sculpt a head, and let's say you want to start with a sphere. So you have a sphere here, and let's say I just immediately wanted to take this and to start to sculpt. So I would go into the sculpting tab, or I could go into sculpting mode, whatever. So I have my sphere here. First of all, I'm just going to show you a quick thing. To activate symmetry, which works very well in the sculpting mode, you just press, in this case, X, because I want to make it symmetrical on both sides. So let's say you're sculpting something like that thing that I did, and I'm not going to sculpt anything. I'm just going to do a demo. And let's say you wanted to pull out these big ears and make forms for a big ear. Okay, so let's say you might go and you might, obviously you would do the head shape first, but let's just say you're starting with the ears for some reason. You might go and do like mask this part off. You might invert the mask, and then you might go with your move tool, your G, and just basically pull it out. And you might, oh my God, I'll pull these big ears out and I'll make these big ears, and then I'll get rid of the mask, and then maybe I'll, make the very basic beginnings of like a big nose. Here's, a very large nose, and then I'll, make the nose a bit smaller here, and then I'll start to pull out, like the beginnings of a chin, and I'll push this up like that, and then maybe I'll pull the back of the head out, and I'll make the ears even bigger. And you start to see a very, very basic and obvious problem is that the polygons are very, very stretched out. Now, it's cool. The good thing about the sculpting is that you can do it in a very free form. You can do it in a free way. I'm not thinking about edge loops. I'm just thinking about the shape. So, but immediately you see something, and I'll go to edit mode, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Look at the polygons. You have a bunch here that are very small, and you have a bunch here that are massively stretched out. And when you sculpt, you do not want this. When you're sculpting in 3D, you basically want to have an even distribution of polygons everywhere. And I'll show you why that is. So if I was going back to the sculpting, obviously this is extremely low poly, but I still will show you the idea. If let's say you wanted to go and add some kind of detail or something like that. Now I took the draw sharp brush. If I go from this area here, which is very dense, to this area, you'll see that it behaves completely differently. So I'll put this up strong, and I'll make it even stronger. So this is moving them down like that. And then as I go here, nothing's happening. So that's pushing them down and nothing's happening. That's because the polygons here are each this big and it's not going to have any effect. So you can't sculpt in any kind of smooth way like this. You don't want to be able to do any, you don't want to have detail or to make detail when your polygons have massively different sizes. You want a general even distribution. Now, what you could do is you could go in the old school way. You would go back and maybe start adding adding edge loops or something like that, and trying to retopologize it or something like that. And oh, I'll add an edge loop here, and maybe I'll add an edge loop there. And yeah, okay, you could do that, but first of all, it's very non-intuitive, and you're adding these terrible edge loops everywhere, and it's obviously not the way to do it. So the way that usually people do this when they're sculpting, I'll remove that by the way, that was weird edge loops, is that they're basically using what's called voxel remeshing. So right now, this is very, very, uneven. If I go to this tab over here, remesh, it will instantly remesh the whole thing. And I can choose what resolution to mesh to remesh it at. So right now it's set for 0.1 meters, which just means like 10 centimeters, I guess. If I remesh this, you're going to see what happens. First of all, it starts to turn into way more polygons, and it has this very specific look of very kind of bumpy polygons. That's because it made, I'll show you what the topology looks like now. It made all of these polygons into small polygons, but sometimes in a strange way. Voxel remeshing, as I showed you before, doesn't look even like quad remeshing. It doesn't look like perfect quads. It has this strange look of sort of like patching together because it works on an algorithm. It makes puts polygons where it thinks it should, and it does it in a way that is not necessarily great topology, but it's very useful for sculpting. So even on something that's this rough, for something like this, if I wanted to, first of all, I'm going to smooth this out a little bit. So if I have my smooth brush and I start to smooth it, you'll see that I can actually smooth this out. And I can start to actually now have a lot more control because now instead of one gigantic polygon, there are many. So now I can start and I can keep moving my polygons around and I have much more control because now it's basically subdivided. But it's not just subdivided, it's completely remeshed. It didn't just take that one giant polygon and split it up. It made an even polygon distribution all over the whole mesh. So now I can actually go in and reshape it and I can continue to work with it. And for now, if I show you what I was trying to do before, if I now go with this draw sharp tool, it works, it goes all the way. It acts quite evenly. And of course, this is at a very, very low resolution. And I'm going to show you in the sculpting video how generally when you sculpt, you start with a very low resolution and you get progressively more resolution, meaning more polygons. If I was to sculpt a head, this would be, I would start with even less polygons than this. I keep it very, very low poly and pull things to where I could no longer pull them. And then I would do this. And then I keep moving it around to get the basic shape. And then I would subdivide it again. So for some reason, imagine that for some reason, I think this is a really good shape. And I think now I'm ready to add more detail. Well, I'll go back to the remesh. And now instead of setting it at 0.1, I can change the resolution. The smaller the voxel size, that means the smaller the polygon, and the more there will be. So if I go and said 0.01, let's say, and I remesh this, now it still looks very rough because it hasn't been smoothed. But watch this. Now when I smooth this, I'm going to have to go and put my smooth brush much stronger. Now it's able to be very smooth. And of course, I would never do this when I was sculpting. I would just smooth a big surface like this. But you can see that this is now very, 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 very sculptable, and you can start to do a lot of details with it. And again, if I take my draw sharp, go all the way through, and there's no difference in this part to this part. So, and if I go again to the edit mode, you'll see that it's again extremely high poly. It is, I look at the thing, 274,000 polygons. And I'll go back to this. I'll get rid of this horrible looking thing because I want to actually sculpt something real. If I go back to this guy, this was just done in the same way, which is pulling things out and progressively going from a very rough shape to a more refined shape. And everything, when you see people sculpt, that's what it is. You go from a very rough shape with big voxels, big polygons, to progressively more refined shape. And you get basically smaller and smaller on the voxel size. So that's basically how you would sculpt something, and that's a lot of the times that's the first step that people do when they're sculpting. They will basically use this remesh function and keep remeshing their sculpture to get it a bit more refined, and then work on it more. And then when it's at its limit, remesh it again, and now start to carve more details. Remesh it again, do more fine details, and in the end, you can have a very detailed sculpture. Now, the other problem with the Voxel remesh is that this is definitely not usable for any kind of animation. Like, first of all, it's extremely high poly, so you could never animate this. It's way too high poly. And also, the polygons are very weirdly laid out. So what normally happens, and you can watch videos about this, or maybe one day I'll make one. What normally would happen at this point, or once the sculpture's done, is the person would then re-topologize it, and they would make a new version of this, a low poly version, and they would then make a version that has quads. And I will actually, before, instead of trying to explain this, I will show you. So imagine you had this thing and you wanted to make something that was actually usable for animation, a low poly version. So something that could be done would be to use a program like I'm going to show you, which is quad remesh. And I will do this, and it won't be great, but I'll do this in an automatic way. So imagine you have this very high poly thing. I'm going to remesh it with this automatic program. And while this is loading, I will tell you that the stage that we're at now, where you would have a sculpture, which is the shape is good, but the topology is unusable, you would then do what's called a retopology. I'm doing one now in an automatic way. But in real life, you wouldn't do it automatically. You would actually, by hand, retopologize this whole thing. And there's many videos about the subject of retopology, but it's an advanced subject that, for what we're doing, it's totally unnecessary. But I just wanted to show you what I'm talking about. So once this actually finishes, okay, so now you see, I'll take off the eyes. It looks like now it's actually quads, and it's much more low poly. It doesn't look very good because there's all these weird loops, but anyway, we'll just say now this is something that could potentially be kind of animatable, even though it's not great. But it's not millions of polygons. Now this is only 7 or 8,000. And what you would do is you would take something like this and you would add a modifier, which is called multi-resolution, which I've showed in another video, which allows you to make progressive subdivisions. So I can subdivide this now, and it's going to become more refined. Now it's, well, you don't see it there, but it is. The other thing I will do is I will add what is called a shrink wrap modifier. This is going to take this version here, the low version, and it's going to be able to shrink it around the more detailed version. So I'm going to show you how I do this. I am now going to take the shrink wrap modifier, which is this. There'll be a video on it, but I just wanted to show you this. And you're going to choose what you want to shrink wrap this on. You see it's very smooth. It doesn't have any of the details of before. But if I shrink wrap it on, is it this one? Let's see. Yes, on that. Now look what happened. It just shrink wrapped it along my sculpted version. And I can make it even more follow the original one by giving another subdivision level. And you see now it basically looks like my original one. But the difference is this version, if you see the actual polygons, it looks like that. They're all quads. There's not millions and billions and trillions of them. And if this was done, if I took more time to actually do this, this could be something that could be used in a video game because it's way, way, way lower poly. But it is now shrink wrapped around my original sculpture, and now from this, I could make something called a normal map, which would reproduce the look of the detailed one on the low poly one. And that's basically what you do for video games. The low poly model has a has something called a normal map, which is basically an impression of the high poly model. So you have a low resolution model, which looks like the high resolution one because of this thing called the normal map. And you would do it in some way along this way by having a re-topologized version, but basically shrink wrapping or projecting it on, or projecting the detailed version onto this low version. Now it's very difficult to explain this. I'm just showing you in a very kind of brief way, but that's kind of like the general process that's done. Make the very detailed version, the sculpture, make a lower resolution version, and basically project the details of the detailed version onto the lower one, and then make these maps. And of course, once again, there are many videos which describe this process in much more detail than I'm showing you, because I'm just showing you a very brief overview. But that's the kind of rough process. Now in the next video, I'm actually going to sculpt something from a sphere, so you'll see actually like a sculpture being done. Now he just looks like, you know, some guy, and you don't really understand how it was done from a sphere, but you will, because I'll do that in the next video. Okay, well hopefully that wasn't that confusing.